So if you've ever played like a massive open world video game, you probably know the trap I'm talking about.
Yeah, where you get completely derailed by the side quests.
Exactly. You're in, the first village and you pick up this tiny, seemingly insignificant side quest, like deliver a letter or, I don't know, find a lost item.
Right, something that feels like filler.
Yeah. But then, like 40 hours later, you suddenly realize that this little side quest is actually the main storyline.
It's the thing dictating the entire game.
It unlocks the whole map, it defines the main conflict, and everything you thought was the main game, just background noise.
It's a massive paradigm shift.
It really is. And well, today's deep dive into our source material asks you to view human history through that exact same lens. We're unpacking an extensive text and a series of detailed demographic infographics by Chris R. Villasis.
And he's exploring the theological framework of the Christian mission to the nations, right?
Yep. Right. But he's examining how this specific worldview claims that the global spread of this message isn't just like an extracurricular activity for the church. It's not a side project.
According to Villasis, this outward mission is the central, driving narrative of the entire world.
Which is, okay, let's unpack this. Because that forces a complete paradigm shift for anyone approaching this material, whether you're inside or outside that specific faith tradition.
Absolutely. Because Villasis is systematically dismantling a very common, very modern assumption.
A cynical one, right?
Yeah, the arguably cynical idea that global Christian missions are merely, well, a byproduct of 19th century European colonialism. Or, maybe worse, just a modern corporate-style program designed to boost institutional membership numbers.
Like it's just a franchise expanding.
Exactly. But the thesis here is that mission is theological long before it is strategic. It's baked into the cosmological architecture of this belief system from the absolute beginning.
So let's dig into that cosmological architecture. Because what fascinated me is that Villasis doesn't start this timeline with, a 19th century explorer in a pith helmet.
Right. No.
He doesn't even start it with the early church and the book of Acts. The starting line is drawn before the clock of the universe even starts ticking.
Which is a huge conceptual leap. The text explicitly roots this global mission in eternity.
Yeah, he points to texts like Ephesians 1, right?
Yes, Ephesians 1, which speaks of a redeemed people chosen before the foundation of the world, and also Revelation 13, which references the lamb slain before the foundation of the world.
So the philosophical implication here, and Villasis leans really heavily on this, is that redemption was never an improvisation.
Right. It wasn't a divine panic attack.
I love that phrasing. Like when humanity goes off the rails, it's not a plan B scenario where the creator has to, hastily patch the software.
Yeah. Right. There's no frantic rewriting of the code. The spread of this specific gospel worldwide is framed as the historical unfolding of a mercy that was already fully planned, fully finalized before matter even existed.
And understanding that underlying mechanism it totally changes how you read the entire historical narrative.
Because if the mission is plan A, then the world's rebellion, its fracturing, its systemic idolatry, none of it is a surprise that derails the project.
Right. And if we look at the creation narrative in Genesis through this lens, that global outward-facing horizon is there immediately, like right out of the gate.
You're talking about the creation mandate in Genesis 1.
Yeah, the task given to humanity to fill the earth and subdue it. And reading Villasis's breakdown of that mandate, I realized my modern brain immediately maps filling the earth onto just like basic biology and agriculture.
To populate the planet and grow some food.
Yeah, exactly. But he argues the commission is primarily cultural and spiritual. Humanity was commissioned to act as, active image-bearing representatives.
Taking the raw material of the earth and turning it into a cultivated theater of divine glory.
Which is such a vivid way to put it.
And it means the mandate isn't just about geographic expansion. It's about civilizational development that reflects a specific divine character. The intention from day one was a universal scope.
It's all about the trajectory.
Right. The mandate to fill the earth with human life perfectly anticipates the later biblical mandate to fill the earth with disciples.
And the detail that completely rewired my understanding of this was his spatial analysis of the Garden of Eden.
Oh, the geography of it.
Yes, because the assumption is usually that Eden was, a utopian gated community, a closed ecosystem where humanity was meant to just sit comfortably in a state of static perfection forever.
But the geography itself, according to Genesis 2, involves rivers flowing out of Eden.
Out of it, not just circling inside it.
Right. Those rivers symbolize a blessing, a life-giving force, actively moving from the sanctuary of the garden out into the uncultivated, wild world.
It frames Eden not as a permanent residence, but as a beachhead.
A starting point for an expedition.
Exactly. And if you as a listener consider the psychological shift there, framing the basic human condition not as this static state of being, but as a forward-moving trajectory, it changes everything.
It means humanity is designed to be going somewhere, taking a specific culture and blessing outward.
But obviously, looking at the geopolitical reality of the world today, or even thousands of years ago, the Earth did not become a utopian theater of divine glory.
No, it certainly did not. We hit the great interruption.
The fall.
Right. And the framework Velazquez presents for the fall is crucial here. He doesn't define sin merely as a collection of private individual moral failures. Like, it's not just about somebody telling a lie or stealing an apple.
It's systemic.
Deeply systemic. It infects politics, speech, cultural production, worship. Humanity takes that inward, localized rebellion and attempts to institutionalize it.
Which brings us perfectly to the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Because if the original mandate was outward expansion and integration, Babel is like the ultimate anti-mission.
It's the total inversion of the plan. Humanity clusters together. They achieve a unified front, but they unite specifically against the divine mandate.
Seeking to make a name for themselves by building a tower, they're centralizing power instead of dispersing blessing.
Babel represents the human instinct for tyrannical homogenization.
Tyrannical homogenization, that's a heavy phrase.
But it's accurate, right? Think about it. If a corrupted humanity speaks with one voice, shares one language, and acts with a centralized, unipolar mind, the capacity for systemic, unchecked evil is mathematically boundless.
Oh, wow. So the divine response, confusing their language and scattering the nations, which is traditionally taught as this harsh, punitive judgment.
Velazquez argues it was also a profound structural mercy.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that mercy, because fracturing human society and introducing linguistic chaos sounds on paper like a sociological disaster.
It does. But think of it as a divine quarantine.
A quarantine.
Yeah. By confusing the languages and scattering the populations, the unified capacity for self-destruction is artificially limited. The virus of systemic rebellion is isolated into different linguistic and geographic pockets.
So it cannot entirely consume the host. That makes so much sense. But this quarantine also establishes the exact demographic problem that the rest of the historical mission must solve.
Exactly. The world is now fractured, alienated, and characterized by mutual incomprehension.
We basically have a globe full of isolated, sick networks. The unified human project is shattered. And the immediate pivot point in the Old Testament narrative, the launch of the counteroffensive, so to speak, is the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12.
Right. God calls Abraham to leave his localized context, promising to make him a great nation.
But the operative clause of that covenant, the whole teleological goal of it, is that final line. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
And Velazquez really zeroes in on that concept of election. Historically, religious groups have treated being the chosen people as, a VIP status.
Like a divine privilege that allows them to build a wall, sit on a hill, and look down at the unchosen masses.
Right, but the text argues that election is never mere privilege. It is entirely about vocation.
That is the core missiological mechanism of the Old Testament. Israel was chosen to act as a conduit. In Exodus 19, they are explicitly designated a kingdom of priests.
And a priest, by sociological definition, does not exist for their own benefit. They exist for mediation.
They stand between two parties.
Yes, Israel was designed to represent God to the scattered nations of Babel and represent the scattered nations before God. Their legal codes, their tabernacle, their sacrificial system, all of it had a missional outward-facing significance.
The surrounding cultures were supposed to observe this society and be drawn back into the divine orbit.
And the poetic and prophetic literature of the text is absolutely saturated with this idea.
Oh, totally. Like Psalm 67 explicitly asks for God to bless Israel so that his saving power may be known among all nations.
And Isaiah, he envisions a day when the temple will be a house of prayer for all peoples and talks about a coming servant who will be a light for the nations.
Right. The prophets aren't agitating for a localized political restoration of borders. They're laying the theological groundwork for the scattered fragments of Babel to stream back together.
But the tragedy of the narrative is that historical Israel repeatedly failed in that priestly vocation.
They succumbed to the exact same localized idolatries as their neighbors.
Which inevitably led to their exile. They were conquered and forcibly scattered among the nations they were originally intended to bless.
It's deeply ironic. But Velazquez points out this fascinating sociological mirror effect here. Through the exile, Israel is forced to physically experience the exact alienation, displacement, and powerlessness that the rest of humanity had been experiencing existentially since Babel.
It is a shared trauma that sets the stage for a shared redemption.
The prophetic promises of restoration like Ezekiel 36, talking about a new heart and a new spirit, make it clear that simply rebuilding the physical walls of Jerusalem, which eventually happened under Ezra and Nehemiah, was insufficient.
Right. It was a partial, localized fix to a cosmic, global problem. The world required a much deeper intervention.
Which acts as this massive funnel, right, drawing this sprawling, multi-millennial narrative, the eternal plan, the outward flowing garden, the quarantine of Babel, the vocation of Abraham, the trauma of the exile down into a single historical figure.
Jesus of Nazareth.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because within this framework, Jesus is not merely a teacher advancing the mission. He is the content, the authority, and the ultimate goal of it.
His ground-level ministry systematically dismantled the localized, ethnocentric boundaries that had calcified over centuries.
He steps right over the geopolitical lines. He travels into Gentile territory. He engages with Samaritans. He openly commends the faith of Roman centurions, often utilizing them as foils to critique the insularity of his own people.
But the absolute pinnacle of this boundary breaking, according to Velazquez, is the crucifixion itself. The text references Ephesians 2, claiming the cross broke down the dividing wall of hostility.
To understand the gravity of that phrase, we really have to look at the first century sociological landscape, right?
We do. The divide between Jew and Gentile wasn't just, mild cultural preference. It was an impenetrable wall of religious, dietary, and social hostility.
And theologically, Velazquez argues this ethnic hostility is a symptom of the deeper hostility between humanity and God.
Right. And by absorbing the judgment of that rebellion on the cross, the basis for human-to-human hostility is legally and spiritually nullified.
Because you cannot maintain ethnic supremacy when both sides are forced to approach the divine through the exact same mechanism of unmerited grace.
It levels the playing field completely.
Which perfectly explains the scope of the marching orders Jesus issues post-resurrection.
The Great Commission.
Yeah, in Matthew 28, where he commands his followers to make disciples of all nations, not just the culturally proximate ones, not just the ones within the borders of the Roman Empire, all nations.
The author breaks down the anatomy of that command so well. First, it relies on absolute authority. Christ claims all authority in heaven and on earth. Second, the scope is universally comprehensive.
And third, the action is not merely informational, it is making disciples, which involves the deep transformative work of baptism and teaching.
It is the active, boots-on-the-ground realization of the promise made to Abraham millennia prior.
But the engine required to actually execute that mandate.
Yep.
That's introduced a few pages later in the book of Acts during the Festival of Pentecost. And I have to say, the way Velazquez juxtaposes Pentecost with Babel is just a masterclass in narrative symmetry.
It really is. It provides the linguistic and sociological solution to the quarantine we discussed earlier.
Let's think about the mechanics of it.
Yeah.
At Babel, a prideful humanity centralizes, and the divine response is to confuse their languages so they can't collaborate on their rebellion. But at Pentecost, the early followers of Jesus are gathered, the Holy Spirit descends, and suddenly they're communicating in the diverse native languages of all the foreign pilgrims in Jerusalem.
And you have to ask, why didn't the Spirit just give everyone a single unified language again? Like, why not revert back to the pre-Babel settings?
Exactly. Why keep the many languages?
Because the goal isn't homogenization. It is unified diversity. Babel utilized linguistic confusion to scatter pride. Pentecost utilizes linguistic multiplicity to gather a redeemed people.
It validates the diverse cultures and languages of the earth by using them as the very vehicle for the gospel.
The Holy Spirit does not erase ethnic identity. The Spirit translates the divine invitation into it.
And the immediate result is this undeniable centrifugal force. The church is violently pushed outward. In Acts 1.8, the geographical progression is laid out plain as day. Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth.
And the rest of the historical record is just watching that map unlock. Philip goes to the marginalized Samaritans. Peter is forced out of his comfort zone to interact with Cornelius, a Roman Gentile.
And Paul. Paul's entire career is built on the premise that he is the tip of the spear, the apostle specifically tasked with bringing this message to the non-Jewish world.
Paul views his sociological reality, all his travels, his shipwrecks, his church planting, as the direct, real-time fulfillment of Isaiah's ancient prophecy.
The early church did not see itself as a new religion. They saw themselves as the climax of the eternal plan.
Exactly.
So we've traced the philosophical and historical arc from before the universe existed up through the first century. But Velasquez pivots incredibly hard from ancient theology to modern data.
Oh, the demographic infographics.
Yeah, this deep dive into his data forces you to confront what this mission looks like right now on a macro global scale. And the transition from theological theory to statistical reality is, honestly, it's jarring.
It is. The infographics map the current global population at roughly 8.1 billion individuals.
8.1 billion.
Right. And according to the provided datasets, approximately 3.3 billion of those people have heard this specific gospel message in a form that allows them to make an informed response.
Which leaves a staggering 4.8 billion people who lack meaningful access. 4.8 billion.
It's an unfathomable number, and the data breaks this down further into over 7,400 unreached people groups.
Now, I want to pause here and dive into the missiological data tracking, because there is a distinct discrepancy between the sources Velasquez provides, and I think it's important we don't take sides, but just impartially report what's here.
Right, the discrepancy in the numbers.
Yeah, one infographic cites 7,400 unreached people groups, but another one cites over 40,000. How does a framework driven by statistics reconcile a gap of 32,000 groups?
Well, it exposes the immense anthropological difficulty of defining a people group. The variance entirely depends on how granular the missiological database chooses to be.
Okay, so it's a methodology difference.
Exactly. The 7,400 number likely utilizes a broader sociocultural or geopolitical grouping, whereas the 40,000 number utilizes strict ethno-linguistic boundaries.
Let's push on that a bit. So if two tribes share a common root language but are separated by, say, a mountain range, and they have historically been at war for centuries, do you count them as one group because of the linguistics or two because of the sociology?
Precisely the issue. If you use the highly granular definition, mapping every distinct dialect, intermarriage pattern, and cultural microidentity, the map fractures into 40,000 pieces.
Yeah.
If you zoom out, it condenses.
But Valisis argues that this statistical debate, while fascinating for demographers, doesn't dilute the primary theological conclusion.
Right. Whether it's 7,000 broad groups or 40,000 microgroups, a massive multi-billion person swath of humanity currently exists outside the blast radius of the historical mission. The harvest is plentiful, as the text says.
The gospel access gradient visual he provides really drives this home for me. It color codes the globe from areas of heavy concentration, over 90% access, down to regions with less than 10%.
And Velasquez attaches a very specific, almost uncomfortable eschatological urgency to this map.
He ties the completion of this demographic penetration directly to the end of human history as we know it.
The implication being that the timeline of the universe is tethered to the geographic and cultural spread of this message.
Which is a heavy burden. So the mechanics of actually closing that gap, how a localized community executes a global mandate, is where Velasquez introduces his 6-step cycle and his 7 keys to faithful mission.
The cycle itself is a very logical progression.
Yeah, it goes proclaim the word, believe through conviction, baptize into community, teach through ongoing discipleship, multiply by raising leaders, and send those leaders out to start the cycle in a new demographic.
It's systematic.
Yeah.
But it's his keys that act as a massive critique of how modern religious organizations often operate today.
He argues the mission must be, first and foremost, pneumatic, spirit-led.
This is a direct counter to the management project approach to religion.
Right.
If an organization treats the global mission like a Fortune 500 corporate expansion, relying on marketing metrics, focus groups, and strategic resource allocation, Velasquez argues they have fundamentally misunderstood the mechanism.
Because without the active guiding agency of the Holy Spirit, the mission devolves into mere manipulation and sociological technique, and technique cannot generate spiritual resurrection.
He also stresses it must be ecclesial, meaning tethered to the local church.
Oh, I found this part so interesting. The romanticized Lone Ranger missionary heading off into the jungle with just a Bible and a machete, untethered from any community accountability.
It's a modern fiction that this framework flat out rejects.
The local church is both the incubator for the mission and the desired end product of it.
But perhaps the most jarring corrective he offers is that the mission must be cruciform, shaped by the cross. He explicitly warns that the gospel advances through sacrifice, suffering, profound misunderstanding, and sometimes martyrdom.
And that begs the question, why is that necessary? Why does suffering have to be the mechanism? It feels incredibly counterintuitive to a modern Western mindset obsessed with viral growth, frictionless expansion, and easy success.
Well, because a cruciform methodology acts as a filter. It prevents the commercialization of the religion.
A filter.
Yeah. If the mission promised health, wealth, and immediate societal dominance, it would attract opportunistic careerists.
People just looking for power.
Exactly. By hardwiring suffering and marginalization into the DNA of the expansion, it ensures that the outward flow is driven by genuine, self-emptying love, mirroring the exact method Jesus used to break down the ethnic hostilities we discussed earlier.
You cannot conquer the world with political dominance if your foundational symbol is an instrument of state execution.
That's a powerful way to put it.
And speaking of politics, Velazquez draws a conclusion here that has, well, explosive implications for our current global climate. He argues that because this mission is universally mandated for all nations, it inherently and aggressively relativizes all earthly identities.
It acts as an absolute solvent against nationalism. If a believer accepts this framework, they must acknowledge that no single culture, no empire, and no modern superpower has a monopoly on the divine kingdom.
If your ultimate allegiance is to a king who claims authority over the entire globe, that severely downgrades the importance of your passport.
It neuters ethnic pride and civilizational arrogance.
Historically, when the church aligns too closely with a specific national identity, whether it's the Roman Empire or modern political movements, it fundamentally betrays the Abrahamic covenant.
Because the other across the border is not a geopolitical threat. They are the exact demographic target of the eternal plan.
That paradigm shift completely alters the sociology of the local church. If a congregation actually believes their primary identity is an eschatological, boundary-breaking community, their local fellowship should reflect the diversity of the ultimate goal.
These should be the most fiercely integrated communities on earth because they recognize the shared baseline of unmerited grace.
Which all accelerates toward a very specific final horizon. Velazquez concludes the timeline with two concepts that modern culture generally despises: judgment and consummation.
Heavy topics.
Very. Let's tackle judgment first, because he frames the call to repent in Acts 17 not as an arrogant threat, but as an act of deliverance.
Modern sensibilities often view the concept of divine judgment as primitive or stingy. But Velazquez argues that to warn humanity of impending objective justice and simultaneously provide the only mechanism for rescue is the definition of mercy.
Right. If the cosmos is a moral universe, judgment against systemic evil, the very evil that built the Tower of Babel and perpetuates global hostility, is necessary for final healing.
The gospel is the merciful summons issued by the approaching judge before the gavel falls.
Which clears the path for the consummation. Drawing on the highly symbolic imagery of Revelation chapter 7 and 21, the end of this massive multimillennial trajectory is not a barren, ethereal heaven.
No. And it is certainly not a collapsed, failed mission where God destroys the earth in frustration and rescues a tiny handful of people.
The vision is a healed, physically renewed creation. The narrative ends with the kings of the earth bringing the unique, purified glory of their diverse cultures into the new city.
The gathered community is a multitude that cannot be numbered.
And it is explicitly, defiantly multi-ethnic, from every tribe and language and people and nation. The linguistic and cultural diversity created at Babel and validated at Pentecost is permanently enshrined in eternity.
The global mission doesn't flatten human culture into a boring, uniform monolith. It purifies the diversity and directs it toward unified worship.
To summarize Velazquez's central thesis, the mission to the nations is the absolute center of gravity for human history. The church does not exist to hold a holding pattern. It exists as the outward form of God's covenantal purpose.
And if you align yourself with this framework, the existential challenge is massive. The primary question of a believer's life shifts from an inward self-protective, how can I be safe, to an outward missional, how can Christ be known?
It demands that your resources, your geography, and your political allegiances all bend toward this single eternal trajectory. You are fundamentally defined as a sent person.
It leaves absolutely no room for an insulated, consumer-driven religious experience.
None at all. But here is the final provocative thought I want to leave you with, building on this entire cosmological architecture. Velazquez states that in the new creation, the mission, as we understand it in the present sense, is over.
The 4.8 billion unreached have been reached.
Right. The scattered fragments of Babel are permanently gathered. The side quest that define the entire game is finally complete.
The eschatological goal is achieved.
But consider the psychology of that moment. If the entire driving force of human history and the singular unifying purpose of the church for thousands of years has been this outward, forward-moving, cruciform mission, what happens to the human psyche when the frontier is gone?
It's a profound question. Does a community whose entire identity was forged in the act of being sent know how to exist when they are finally permanently settled?
How does an expeditionary force transition into an eternal civilization when the map is fully unlocked?
It implies that the creativity and cultural mandate of Eden will resume, but on an unimaginable scale.
It's an incredible philosophical puzzle, something for you to keep turning over in your mind. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into these sources today.
Yeah.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we will see you next time.